In April 1545, an indigenous llama herder named Diego Huallpa was climbing a mountain in the Bolivian highlands, chasing an animal that had wandered off at nightfall. To survive the freezing cold at that altitude, he lit a fire against the bare rock. By morning, a thread of silver had melted and pooled at his feet. He had just stumbled onto the richest deposit of silver ever found on Earth. Within 40 years, that single mountain would produce more silver than the rest of the planet combined. It would fund the Spanish Empire's wars for over a century, crash prices in Ming China, trigger the first true global inflation, poison a mountain range with mercury that scientists can still detect today, and cost an estimated 1 to 8 million lives. Today, if you own a silver ring, a coin, a piece of electronics, there is a real chance the raw metal running through the modern global economy traces back, in principle, to that one mountain. Nobody thinks twice about it. So how did a frozen hillside in the Andes end up rewriting the economics of the entire world? The mountain Huallpa found was called Cerro Rico, literally, rich hill. And the name was not an exaggeration or a piece of marketing. When Spanish assayers tested the first ore samples pulled from its slopes, they could not believe the readings. Some veins ran at purities so extreme that modern mining engineers, looking back at the historical records, still describe them as geologically freakish. Silver ore so concentrated, it barely needed refining before it could be struck into coin. Word of the discovery reached the Spanish colonial administration within months, and by 1546, a mining settlement had already been founded at the base of the mountain, at an altitude of over 4,000 meters above sea level. One of the highest cities ever built by human beings up to that point in history. The air there is thin enough that newcomers today still struggle to walk uphill without stopping to breathe. The Spanish built an entire metropolis on that thin air anyway, because the ground beneath it was worth more than anywhere else on the continent. Potosí grew the way gold rush towns grow everywhere in history, violently, chaotically, and without any real plan. Within a single generation, it became one of the largest cities on the planet, bigger, at its peak, than Madrid, bigger than Rome, bigger than London. Official counts from the year 1611 put its population at somewhere near 160,000 people, crammed into a mining camp at the edge of the known world, a place European maps had barely bothered to draw in accurate detail only a few decades earlier. Silver had built, almost overnight, a city that should not have been able to exist at that altitude, in that climate, that far from any coastline. But a city that size, producing that much wealth, needed labor on a scale nature had never intended for that terrain. And the Spanish crown had already decided, long before the first church was built in Potosí, exactly where that labor was going to come from. In 1573, a Spanish viceroy named Francisco de Toledo formalized a labor system that had existed in a smaller, gentler form under the Inca Empire that Spain had recently conquered. That earlier system was called the mita, and under Inca rule, it had functioned as a kind of rotational public duty. Communities across the empire sent workers for a limited season to build roads, maintain temples, and construct agricultural terraces. And once that season ended, their obligation ended with it. It was, by the standards of forced labor systems in history, a relatively contained arrangement, tied to specific projects with a beginning and an end. Toledo took that existing structure, kept its name, and pointed it permanently at a mountain that never, ever stopped needing bodies. Under the colonial mita, indigenous communities scattered across a radius of hundreds of miles were legally required to send 1/7 of their adult male population to Potosí every single year, without exception, for as long as the mine demanded ore. Men walked for weeks, in some documented cases well over 300 miles, carrying their own food and belongings, to reach a mountain that was not their home, to work for a wage that was set by decree rather than by any market. Once they arrived, they worked underground shifts that could stretch for a full week without a single glimpse of daylight, hauling sacks of ore up wooden ladders bolted into raw rock, in tunnels lit only by candle or lamp, breathing air thick with dust, and later, thick with the toxic mercury vapor released during the refining process. Historians who have spent decades reconstructing the demographic records of this period, parish registers, tribute lists, colonial census counts, estimate that the ITA system, combined with the mercury-based refining process introduced shortly afterward, killed somewhere between 1 and 8 million people over the roughly 2 centuries the system remained in force. That range is wide because record-keeping across an empire of that size, in terrain that remote, was never complete. But even the most conservative estimates describe a demographic wound that entire highland regions never recovered from. Villages that had existed continuously for centuries before the Spanish arrived were left, within a generation or two, almost entirely without adult men. A hollowing out of Andean society that Bolivian and Peruvian historians still study as one of the defining traumas of the colonial period. This decision, to take a limited, seasonal Inca labor duty and stretch it into a permanent, empire-wide extraction machine, must have looked, on the paper it was written on in Toledo's colonial offices, like a simple administrative convenience, a way to formalize something that already existed, a minor bureaucratic adjustment. It was not. The mountain now had its workforce, guaranteed by law, replenished every year whether the previous year's workers had survived or not. What it produced next would not stay in the Andes for very long at all. Raw ore pulled straight out of a mountain is not money. It is rock with metal trapped inside it. And turning that rock into currency required a second transformation, chemical, not just economic, that happened barely a mile from the mine itself, in a refining district the Spanish called Ribera. Spanish engineers introduced a process known as the patio process, named for the open stone courtyards where it took place. Crushed silver ore was mixed with mercury, common salt, and copper sulfate, then spread out across these courtyards in a paste and mixed by treading it underfoot, often literally by workers' bare feet, walking through the toxic slurry for hours, day after day. The mercury bonded chemically with the silver in the ore, forming an amalgam. That amalgam was then heated in furnaces, burning the mercury off as vapor and leaving behind pure, refined silver. It worked extraordinarily well. It also poisoned, slowly and permanently, nearly everyone who worked anywhere near it. The mercury needed for this process came from another brutal mine entirely. Huancavelica, hundreds of miles away in present-day Peru, sometimes called the mine that ate men, because of how lethal the mercury vapor exposure there proved to be for its own forced laborers. Mercury contamination from Potosí's refining district was so extensive and so sustained across 2 centuries that researchers analyzing ice cores drilled from a nearby Andean glacier centuries later can still detect the atmospheric fallout as a distinct pollution layer, one of the very first fingerprints of industrial-scale environmental damage anywhere on the planet. laid down more than 200 years before anyone had coined the phrase industrial revolution. The silver produced through this process was not simply shipped out as bars of raw metal. Potosí had its own royal mint, the Casa de la Moneda, where silver was struck directly into coin on site, so that what eventually left the mountain was not just metal, it was already money, stamped with the Spanish crown's own seal, ready to move through any market on the planet without needing to be melted, tested, or reminted. And move it did, because Spain itself, the empire that owned this mountain outright, was about to become little more than a corridor for the wealth passing through it. Between the years 1500 and 1800, historians estimate that somewhere around 150,000 tons of silver crossed the Atlantic Ocean from Spanish America into Europe, an almost unimaginable quantity of a metal that before this period had been genuinely scarce across the entire continent. And Potosí alone is believed to have accounted for as much as 60% of all the silver mined anywhere in the Americas during the peak decades of the 16th and 17th centuries. One mountain, 60% of a hemisphere's output. Spain's kings did not save this wealth, and they did not invest it in ways that built lasting national wealth either. They spent it, almost as fast as it arrived, on wars against France, against the rebellious Dutch provinces, against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, on maintaining a navy and a royal court, and on servicing enormous debts owed to banking families in Genoa and in Augsburg, who had financed the Spanish crown's military campaigns in advance, using the promise of future silver shipments as collateral. Silver flowed into Spain from the Americas, and in many years flowed almost immediately back out again to pay off foreign creditors who were, in effect, running the actual finances of the Spanish Empire from behind the scenes. What that flood of silver left behind inside Spain and across the rest of Western Europe, however, was inflation on a scale the continent had never experienced before. Economic historians refer to this period as the Price Revolution. Between roughly the year 1520 and the year 1650, prices across Western Europe rose somewhere between 300 and 400%. At a time when ordinary wages for laborers and craftsmen barely moved at all. A sudden flood of new coined silver meant there was simply more money in circulation chasing the exact same amount of bread, wool, and farmland that had existed before. And the people who suffered from that mismatch were never the merchants and bankers importing the metal in the first place. They were the peasants, the day laborers, the ordinary families whose wages never came close to catching up with the rising cost of feeding themselves. A mountain in the Bolivian Andes had just reached invisibly into the pocket of a baker in Antwerp, who had never heard the word Potosí in his entire life, and who had no idea why bread suddenly cost him nearly 4 times what it had cost his father. If a single mine on the other side of the planet, dictating prices for a baker who never left his own city, sounds strange to you, it should, because the story is about to get considerably stranger. If you are finding this as unsettling as we did while researching it, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because we cover stories exactly like this one every week. Stories about a single overlooked object or place, quietly rewriting the rules for everyone else on Earth without anyone really noticing at the time. Because Europe, as it turns out, was only half of Potosí's story. Roughly half of all the silver mined out of that mountain never touched a European port at all. Instead, it was shipped north along the Pacific coast to the Mexican port of Acapulco, loaded onto enormous galleons, and sailed directly across the Pacific Ocean to Manila, in the Spanish-controlled Philippines, and from Manila, it flowed straight into the economy of Ming China. China, at that time, ran on a bimetallic monetary system that was, for internal reasons, tied to its own domestic mining output, chronically short of silver, which the imperial government needed as tax currency to run an empire of well over 100 million people. Potosi's output filled that need so completely and so continuously that many economic historians consider the Manila galleon trade route the exact moment the world's economy became genuinely, structurally global for the very first time in human history. A single unbroken supply chain connecting an Andean mountain, a Spanish colonial mint, a Mexican Pacific port, a months-long ocean crossing, and the treasury of the Chinese imperial court, all tied together by one metal, dug out by forced labor, on the other side of the planet from where it was ultimately spent. In exchange for that silver, Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices flowed back across the Pacific into Spanish America, and from there onward into Europe, completing a loop around nearly the entire globe. A single coin struck at the foot of Cerro Rico, stamped with the Spanish crown seal, could realistically end up within a few years sitting in a merchant's cash box in Beijing, having crossed 2 oceans and 3 continents to get there. No single government sat down and planned this network from the start. No treaty ever created it on purpose. One mountain's output was simply large enough, on its own, to bend the trade routes of 2 separate oceans permanently around it. The world, by the early 1600s, ran in significant part on one mineral, dug out of one mountain, by workers who were legally compelled to be there. And that kind of concentration, in any system, always eventually finds its breaking point. By some measures, Potosi at its peak was wealthier, city for city, than almost anywhere in Europe. A Spanish saying from that era survives in the language to this day. Vale un Potosí, literally, it's worth a Potosí, meaning something of nearly unimaginable, almost absurd value. The phrase outlived the empire that coined it. The city itself, at its height, supported more than 80 churches for a population that size, an astonishing number funded almost entirely by mining wealth flowing directly into ornate colonial architecture. European visitors who made the difficult journey there described a level of conspicuous consumption that genuinely shocked them. Silver, in a city where it was quite literally cheaper and more available than firewood, being used for something as mundane as horseshoes on the animals that worked the streets. This was the peak. From an altitude, in every sense of the word, that high, there was really only one direction left for things to go. And the mountain that had given up so much for nearly 80 uninterrupted years had already started running out of the one thing that had made it matter in the first place. By the 1650s, the easily accessible high-grade veins near the surface of Cerro Rico had been exhausted. What remained required digging far deeper shafts, more complex and expensive processing, and considerably more labor for considerably less silver per worker than the boom years had ever demanded. Output that had once seemed genuinely limitless began a slow, structural decline that continued for the remainder of the colonial period. Spain, meanwhile, had built an entire imperial financial system, an entire foreign policy, an entire structure of debts and alliances, on the assumption that Potosi's flow of silver would simply keep pace with its obligations forever. It never seriously adjusted that assumption until it was far too late to matter. Historians studying the 17th century decline of Spain as Europe's dominant power point directly to the collapse of Spanish silver output as one of the central structural causes. A kingdom whose entire imperial economy had been running unsustainably on the ore of a single mountain for the better part of a century, with no real plan for what would happen once that mountain finally slowed down. Potosí's population, which had peaked near 160,000 people, began a long, steady decline that lasted for generations. By the 19th century, the city that had once genuinely rivaled London in size held only a small fraction of that former population. Its grand Baroque churches standing over streets that had gone largely quiet, monuments to a wealth that had already moved on to somewhere else. The mountain that had rewired the economics of the entire planet had simply, eventually, run out of the thing that had made anyone care about it in the first place. But ran out is a generous way to put it. The truth is that the mountain kept giving. It just stopped giving on terms that anyone in charge particularly wanted to talk about out loud. Cerro Rico is still actively mined today, nearly 500 years after Diego Huallpa's fire first melted that thread of silver into the frozen ground, by cooperatives of local miners using techniques that, in many of the smaller tunnels, are not dramatically more advanced than the ones used centuries earlier. Miners still chew coca leaves to fight the altitude and hunger during long shifts underground, and many still leave offerings for a deity known locally as El Tío, the uncle, a figure with roots in both Catholic and pre-Columbian belief, believed to control the fate of anyone who enters the mountain's tunnels. The mountain has been so extensively hollowed out over nearly 5 centuries of continuous mining that geologists have repeatedly and publicly warned in recent years that Cerro Rico itself is now at genuine risk of structural collapse, sinking slowly under the weight of its own history. The human cost of that history never fully stopped being counted either. Bolivia's own national identity carries the memory of the Mita as one of its foundational historical wounds, and the silhouette of Cerro Rico itself appears today on Bolivian currency and on the national coat of arms. A mountain that quite literally built someone else's empire on the other side of the ocean, now memorialized on the money of the country it was extracted from in the first place, and largely left behind once it had given up what the world wanted from it. Meanwhile, the economic pattern that Potosí established almost by accident, a single region's raw material dictating prices and shifting power on continents that region would never see, worked by laborers who had no say in any of it, became, in effect, the blueprint for nearly every major resource boom that followed it across the next 4 centuries. Sugar, rubber, guano, oil, and today, cobalt and lithium. Potosí was not an exception in economic history. It was the prototype every later boom would end up quietly repeating. Which brings us back to that coin, that ring, that circuit board sitting somewhere in your own home right now. The ones nobody ever thinks twice about. There was no war declared over Potosí. There was no treaty signed anywhere to deliberately create the trade network it ended up building across 2 oceans. There was only a fire, lit against a cold rock face on a mountainside in 1545 by a man chasing a lost animal in the dark, and a thin thread of silver that melted and pooled at his feet by morning. It felt like an accident. It was not. It felt, to everyone living through its peak, like it would last forever. It did not. It felt from the outside like it was simply a mountain. It never, ever was. The next time you see a piece of silver jewelry, a coin sitting forgotten in a drawer, or a component tucked inside your phone, it's worth remembering that the modern global economy, the entire idea that one commodity from one place can move prices for people who will never see it, on the other side of the planet, was proven possible for the very first time in recorded history by a hole dug into a single Andean hillside, at a human cost that history barely bothered to record accurately while it was happening. If this story stayed with you, go ahead and hit subscribe. We dig into stories exactly like this one every single week, the ones where a single overlooked object turns out to have quietly rewritten the rules for the entire world. And let us know in the comments below, which part of this one surprised you the most?